Hola, cage fighting connoisseurs. This is KidNate at BloodyElbow.com. I'm back in the MMA bunker. Water supplies are set in, doors are locked, shades are drawn, semi-automatic close at hand. We are ready to talk the ugly cesspit of the MMA business world. Oh, what a cluster. What a cluster. Last week, we had the news that Bjorn Rebney, former boss of Bellator, now the head of the MMAAA, a new fighters association, apparently in competition with the old MMAFA, which has been suing the UFC in a class action lawsuit on behalf of fighters alleging monopolistic behavior. Well, last week, Bjorn Rebney, GSP, Tim Kennedy, former heavyweight champ Cain Velasquez, former bantamweight champ TJ Dillashaw, and Donald Cerrone stood up and said a bunch of shit about the UFC and how they're all going to come together as the MMAAA and solve it all, stand up for the fighters, just the UFC fighters, not fighters in general, just the UFC fighters. And they did mention there's some connection with CAA. I believe that's Creative Artists Associates, the second biggest, or maybe they're the biggest agency group in Hollywood, the biggest being, or their biggest rival being, William Morris Endeavor, headed by Ari Emanuel, the new owners of the UFC. So it's a tangled web already. But no sooner did they get their shit together, do their big press conference, then young Donald Cerrone gets in the headline saying, I'm easing off on this MMA talk. I didn't know I was going to be on the board of anything. As his quote, as far as the association goes, man, says Cerrone, Georges and Tim called me and asked me to be part of it. I didn't know I was sitting on a board. That kind of took me by surprise, sitting there like, oh, wow. I spoke to Dana, that's Dana White, UFC president, today on the phone. He's coming to town, and we're going to go out to dinner and talk. There's a lot of things I think this sport needs, retirement pensions, healthcare, things I think we need. He doesn't mention I could probably use another locker room bonus. Maybe Dana will have a bag of cash on the table. I don't know. Maybe Dana's just bringing the whip and the nose twister to put Cerrone in his place. But either way, Cerrone, I believe, is back on board with the UFC. I wasn't sitting there saying, he said, moving forward today, we're going out on strike. We need more money. That wasn't coming out of my mouth at all. There were a couple of people that were there I don't plan on working with and being a part of, not mentioning any names. Is he talking about Bjorn Rebney? I don't know. Back to Donald. Quote, Donald says, I was there mostly just not saying I'm leading a board or I'm sitting on a board, but more voicing my opinion of what this sport needs. Moving forward, I'm still going to stand strong with those and say this is what I believe we need. I believe as a whole we need health care. We need some kind of potential pension for retirement. The UFC has been nothing but great to me. I can't complain. They give me what I want. And like Dana said, I called him and he helped me out. That's true, man. I was in a bind. He got the best lawyers you can pay and saved my ass. Dana White mentioned angrily about the time he bailed Cerrone out of jail. And that's the kind of loyalty that Dana White and the Fertittas long engendered in their fighters because they were there. They bailed out Cerrone. They bailed out Rampage Jackson. I'm sure many others as well that we didn't even hear about. Plus, there's the famous locker room bonuses they like to sprinkle around and give to the fighters. So the whole game in a union versus management conflict is unity. Unity. If you listen to your old Joe Hill songs or Woody Guthrie songs, anybody from the labor movement knows in the union there is strength. The union, the united front. When you have splitters, like you have one organization, the MMAFA, that's organized the class action suit, has gotten legal standing from the courts to sue the UFC on behalf of all fighters that have ever fought in the UFC. And now you've got this new thing that says, no, we're not part of that. Does that strengthen or weaken the effort? It's very interesting. And there's a letter that was sent by some of the lawyers, Eric Kramer and Michael Delangelo of Berger and Montaigne, Benjamin Brown and Richard Kaufman of Cohen, Milstein, Sellers and Toll, and Joseph Saveri. These are the guys representing the fighters in the class action lawsuit. They sent a letter to Bjorn Rebney on December 6th, and Mike Fonseca of CAA and attorney James Quinn CC'd. They expressed concern over certain statements and actions taken by Rebney that they worry could harm MMA fighters by undermining the class action suit. This is from John Nash's report on Bloody Elbow. It came out yesterday or the day before. Here's a quote from the letter. Specifically, you being Bjorn Rebney, said that one of the goals of the MMAAA is to seek a settlement on behalf of current 40 UFC fighters to compensate for lost income due to prior alleged wrongdoing by the UFC. As you are aware, the federal court presiding over the UFC class action has appointed us as co-lead counsel to pursue such claims in the UFC class action. Given that appointment, we, along with the 6 named plaintiff fighters in the case, have made substantial strides on behalf of all UFC fighters over these past 2 years, strides that your recent actions and statements threaten to undo. And so I believe those 6 fighters are Kung Lee, Randy Couture, Nate Quarry, Carlos Newton, and a couple other dudes. I thought Tim Kennedy was involved, but I think he isn't a named plaintiff there. More from the letter from the lawyers. As you must be aware, Bjorn Rebney, establishing a rival group that attempts to recover for identical alleged past harms would only benefit Zuffa, presenting it with the option of paying the lowest bidder to resolve fighters' claims. Your actions could also damage our efforts through the UFC class action to seek a binding court order putting an end to certain of Zuffa's alleged anti-competitive misconduct in furtherance of the goal of creating a more competitive landscape for the sport, benefiting MMA fighters and fans alike. As you must be aware, the fighters are better off united than divided, and thus your attempts to sow division operate to no one's advantage but Zuffa's. So we've got shots fired here. We've got Bjorn trying to present a group, the MMAAA, a terrible, terrible fucking name, by the way, backed by CAA, although he's trying to keep that quiet. And why would a union have investors? Because investors generally want to make money, and a union is a nonprofit. That's a good question. That's a good question there. But he's trying to present this united front, and already having Donald Cerrone on board, you got a traitor there in the midst. Not traitor is a harsh word, whatever. You got a guy that stood up with you, and now he's saying, I didn't mean to so much stand up with you. So, yeah, and then we've got Dana White, of course, firing shots at Bjorn Rebney, and you'll notice none of the fighters standing up with Bjorn Rebney were former Bellator fighters. I'm not seeing Eddie Alvarez up there with him. I'm not seeing George Masvidal up there with him. Masvidal had some colorful things to say about Bjorn Rebney. Lots of guys who worked with Bjorn Rebney in the past not signing up for this effort. So that's a very interesting angle on that. Also note, the letter from the lawyers to Rebney mentions a meeting they had with Rebney and Ken Pavia. You might remember Ken Pavia, the MMA manager, who got in some legal hot water when he allegedly furnished Rebney with an UFC contract that Rebney then used as a basis for Bellator's contracts. So these characters just keep popping back up in the unlikeliest places. And here's another allegation from the lawyers against Rebney. Worse, as we both know, but which you have failed to disclose publicly, you, Bjorn Rebney, your investors and your legal team, had previously sought to be included in our efforts to prosecute the UFC class action as long as you and your investors could share in any recovery. Indeed, well after the UFC class action was underway, at the invitation of Ken Pavia, class counsel agreed to attend an October 15th, 2015 meeting with you as the former CEO of Bellator, representatives of Creative Artists Agency, CAA, Mr. Pavia, and your lawyers at the offices of CAA in New York. According to the letter, and now I'm quoting John Nash, Rebney and his reps said at the meeting that they had already formed the MMAAA. It was supported by hundreds of current and former fighters, and that they were contemplating starting their own antitrust action if plaintiff attorneys did not meet certain demands. And so the idea that the MMA had already been formed at that time seems contradicted by the fact that shortly after the initial meeting on October 15th, Rebney registered the Mixed Martial Arts Athletes Association. The letter also suggests the possibility that other domain names registered by Rebney could be intended for use by planned MMA promotions. So they're planning on promoting fights, allegedly or possibly. Then, according to the letter, 10 days after the meeting, Rebney's attorneys presented the UFC Class Action Council with the demands. You propose that we, and now I'm quoting from the letter, as co-lead counsel, promise to devote a certain percentage of any class-wide recovery in the class action to the MMAAA, which monies you told us would be used for compensating unnamed investors for unspecified expenses occurred in establishing the organization, among other things. You further demanded that your representatives should be allowed full participation in any settlement negotiations that might occur in the class action. As you know, we rejected your demands. So, yikes. So Rebney sort of responded. His attorneys, Jim Quinn and Eric Holkstadt, responded, and that said, yesterday the MMAAA received a cease and desist letter from a group of lawyers seeking to stop the MMA from signing up fighters and sticking up for their rights against the UFC and its owners, wme-img. The MMAAA will do no such thing. Those lawyers, who represent only a few fighters, are focused on getting some money out of one case, of which they seek a significant portion for themselves. Those lawyers do not speak for anyone else, and certainly not the MMAAA and all the fighters the organization represents now, and will quickly grow to represent in the sports. Over a year ago, these same lawyers reached out to the MMAAA to join forces with us. We had a meeting and made clear that the MMAAA, Rebney's Association's primary focus would be on achieving three core goals: substantially increasing UFC fighter pay to 50% of revenue, 2, securing all-encompassing long-term benefits for UFC fighters, and 3, a settlement to compensate past and current UFC fighters for all the UFC's wrongs. To achieve these goals for the benefit of the fighters, we also made clear the MMAAA needed to receive a percentage of a monetary settlement to cover the cost to fund MMA for staffing and attorneys, both for past work getting to this point and the long fight ahead. The lawyers made clear they did not share the MMAAA's MMAAA's vision. They are focused on a short-term monetary recovery, of which they will seek 33%, and then they are gone from this sport. We parted ways. So you've got one group, the MMAAA, who's claiming to represent fighters for the long haul. You've got another group, these class action attorneys, who are claiming to represent the fighters in the big fight, but it's a one-off. It's this lawsuit. They're aligned with the MMAFA, the Mixed Martial Arts Fighters Association, headed by Rob Mazy and others. And that brings us to Randy Couture, member of MMAFA, aligned with Mazy and the trial lawyers, who was in the news this week because a congressman, who's Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma, is having a hearing today, right as I'm doing this, talking about MMA, looking into the possibility of expanding the Ali Act to cover MMA, and Couture is one of the witnesses. And the congressman alleges that the UFC tried to have Couture removed from the witness list. He says, quote, they had threatened to walk because they didn't want to have Couture on the panel. We want them to participate, them being the UFC, but they can't be dictating who we can and cannot have on the panel. This isn't an I gotcha hearing. This is giving perspectives across the board. This is an Energy and Commerce Committee hearing happening on Capitol Hill today. A lot of people up here know, I'm quoting Mullen again, the UFC, but they don't know how it works. They just kind of assume that it works like any other individual sport out there. So we wanted to use this time in the hearing just to inform those up there on the committee so they would understand what the sport is all about. So, you've got a lot of moving pieces here. There's the union fight or associations. Neither of these entities, the MMAFA or the MMAAA, are unions. They're both associations. That has important legal ramifications that I'm not a lawyer, so I can't explain to you, but apparently there's important differences. Then there's the class action suit alleging past wrongdoing and that fighters should be compensated for that. Then there's the Ali Act that would change the entire game, essentially void many of the clauses in the UFC contracts, including the championship clause that says, if you're the champion, you have to defend your belt with the UFC, that you can't go open up bidding to other promoters for your next fight, etc., which the Ali Act explicitly forbids if you're a boxer, but not a mixed martial artist. So you've got all these things, different moving parts, and you've got different players playing in different aspects of these different pieces. Couture testifying before the committee that's talking about the Ali Act, although there's a lot of complicating factors. Zach Arnold, a fight opinion, will tell you that because Donald Trump's president, that no chance of that happening. Entirely possible. that Trump would veto any Ali act that were to get through Congress, should they get it through with the UFC lobbying and paying congressmen right and left. Making campaign contributions. Certainly wouldn't accuse anyone of bribing a congressman. My God. So, as Couture says, I have 14 years history dealing with the UFC and dealing with their contracts as their heavyweight champion at one time. So I'm living proof and a living example of why the Ali Act needs to be amended to include MMA fighters. So, you got Zuffa got out while Gideon was good before all the shit hit the fan. The suit was filed a year or so before their sale, but it was definitely a motivator. They knew Rebney was out there organizing. The CAA, the Creative Artists Association agency, not an association, CAA is an agency, that becomes much more heated once WME becomes the owner of the UFC. Because, when Zuffa owned the UFC and a fighter like Georges St-Pierre was represented by CAA, it was a little different than when they negotiated with a fighter like Ronda Rousey, who is represented by WME, who coincidentally, WME was the UFC's agent. They negotiated the deal with Fox for the UFC. So it was already a little different. And if you're Ronda Rousey, that's like the time I walked into a realtor's office and he had a son who was also a realtor and said, we have access to all these properties that don't come on the public listings, but I act as the seller and my son would act as the buyer's agent. And then you would kind of have a best of both worlds situation while me and my son negotiate both sides of the deal. And I was just thinking, this is like an Eiffel Tower action where your son's getting me from the back and you're getting me from the front. No thanks, dude. If WME is representing you as your agent and the UFC as their agent, that's a fucked deal. That's not a convenient. That's not a win-win. That's a fucking. You're getting fucked. I guarantee it. And so once WME though owns the UFC, CAA fighters like Georges St-Pierre are suddenly way out in the cold. Hence the appeal. So Rebney's been plotting this apparently for a couple of years now, ever since he left Bellator, maybe even before he left Bellator. And now you've got GSP, negotiations to reach a loggerhead. Suddenly GSP's online saying, bloody hell, got a story. GSP says UFC reopens negotiations following the MMAAA announcement. So you put leverage on people, things change. That's what's going on. This is an ugly fight. I don't really have any neat, tidy balls to wrap this up in, but you've got the UFC over here, which no longer has the kind of loyalty with the fighters it used to. Fertitas are gone, and now even guys like Chuck Liddell and Matt Hughes are gone, even though Dana White promised as long as I'm with this organization, you'll have a role. Now he's saying what I meant was as long as I'm in charge of the money behind the organization, you have a job. Kind of weaselly, if you ask me. He's throwing these guys out who helped him build the organization. Dana's still getting paid, presumably quite well, and I believe, if my understanding is correct, and it could be wrong, that Dana still owns a piece of the WME. So whatever. That's the kind of loyalty you got in this world. And the fighters all saw the Fertitas walk away with $4.8 billion in the sale, and that changed the tenor of the whole thing. While it was still a family-owned organization where fighters had personal relationships with these guys, and they had the Machiavellian tactic of the locker room bonus. Randomly Lorenzo and Frank Jr. might be going through the locker room after the fights, just passing out checks. So, things can get real exciting, real fun. That really buys loyalty and inspires hope that other fighters hope they'll be the next guy to get one of these random locker room bonuses. But now that's all gone. WME is cold, clinical. Fighters can't get meetings. They don't have the personal relationship. They know they paid big money, and the fighters are all like, well, where's mine? And, that's where the moving parts come in. So then you got the class action suit aligned with the MMAAA, Rob Mazey's group. And you've got Nate Quarry and Kung Lee and Randy Couture and Carlos Newton, these guys with that. Then over here, you got Bjorn Rebney's group aligned with CAA and these investors that are looking to make money off this deal, presumably. Aligned with GSP, Kane, Tim Kennedy, and TJ Dillashaw, and until yesterday, Donald Cerrone. So it's a muddle. And I think as long as it's a muddle and that there are competing interests, there are entities competing to represent the fighters, the UFC wins. If the fighters organize behind one entity, then they're in a much stronger position to battle WME and the UFC. But if they're split between different groups, particularly if one of those groups is claiming to represent fighters, and if they sign up more fighters than the MMAAA and the class action suit, then they are in an excellent spot to propose a much lower settlement to the UFC. And the thing is, then they get all that money. They share some of it with the fighters. The class action attorneys are fucked out of that money. So even though the pot is less for the fighters, CAA wouldn't be getting, or this, excuse me, the MMAAA wouldn't be getting any of the money from the class action lawsuit unless they were the ones to settle with the UFC. So, I mean, it's an ugly clusterfuck here, and knives are out. They're being held behind backs mostly, but they're also shivving people. I mean, Cerrone, Dana White reaches out to Cerrone. Cerrone falls. The UFC tries to block Randy Couture from testifying at the Muhammad Ali Act hearing. That fails, and they've got at least one congressman pissed at him. Ironically, a former MMA fighter who was almost on the Ultimate Fighter, Mullen. And the lawyer for the UFC I don't think, knew that. According to Mullen, the UFC's lawyer didn't remember him until he said, "Hey, you remember when we negotiated for me to be on Tough?" "Yeah, I remember that. The negotiations didn't work out. I wasn't on Tough. And yeah, I know you, buddy, and I know your tricks." So a lot of moving parts here, but you got some congressmen supporting expanding the Ali Act, including John McCain, to MMA. But on the other hand, you've got Donald Trump with the veto pen. And Dana White spoke at the RNC, the Republican National Convention this summer, endorsing Trump and took a lot of heat from it. But that might pay off in the end here with Trump, if even has to, if they even get the Ali Act expansion through Congress. So they haven't even introduced it as a bill yet. So there's a long way to go there. But the fundamental point is the fighters have been getting screwed for a long ass time. They're getting a much lower share of revenue than comparable athletes, and whether it's boxing, basketball, football, and other performers, musicians, movie actors, podcast hosts. They get a much larger piece of the pie. I mean, a much smaller piece of the pie than comparable performers. And I mean, the only people getting screwed in the creative world comparable are porn performers, I think. You're talking about getting 5 to 8% to 11% of the revenue, whereas other sports, other fields, you're talking 45, 50% of revenue to the performers, which to me is only fair because you're paying to see the performers. If you buy tickets to see Jay-Z, you don't really give a shit about Ticketmaster or who produced this or who packaged it, who's the promoter. You don't care. You're there to see Jay-Z. If you're paying to see Floyd Mayweather fight, Floyd Mayweather should get the money because you're paying to see Floyd Mayweather fight. You're not paying to see Bob Arum fight. You're not paying to see Oscar De La Hoya fight anymore. You're paying those guys get a piece for promoting it, but nobody cares about the promoter. Promoters are fungible. And the UFC has pissed away the brand equity. At one point, people were going to see UFC fights less than to see the fighters. It was about the UFC, the brand. And Dana White was the face of the brand, and fans loved Dana White. But over the years, we've seen Dana White pull so many stunts, and it's become very obvious that Dana White and the owners are taking a much bigger share of the pie than anyone thinks is equitable, or than most reasonable people think is equitable, and that changes things. And then you've got the specter of CTE and the fact that younger and younger fighters might be doing permanent brain damage to themselves by engaging in this sport, particularly sparring in the gym. And that is going to come a cropper at some point. The NFL's already been fighting this tooth and nail because they know it's going to have devastating impact on their sport, and that it's coming for MMA. It's just a matter of time. So you got these forces grinding away at the UFC's monopoly. Meanwhile, WME is under all this pressure because they borrowed literally billions to buy the UFC. They've got to cut costs, raise revenue, do big deals, leverage their fighters into multiple media properties, not just fighters. And you've got CAA back here trying to cut in on that action. So it's a tangled web. I don't know that I helped anybody understand it any better, but Jesus, lots of backstabbing, lots of action. I love this stuff. If you like this, I'll keep doing these shows. In the meantime, follow me on Twitter at KidNate. Read me at bloodyelbow.com. Subscribe to MMANation.com and get all the YouTube shows, or subscribe to MMA Nation on iTunes. Get the audio without the ugly, also on SoundCloud. And Zane and Connor will be back with MMA Vivisection for UFC 206 and UFC Albany later today. We'll have the 6th round for both of those fights Friday night and Saturday night. Eugene Live, Knuckle Up, etc., etc. So I'm planning to do these MMA bunkers weekly. Not sure which day, just whatever day we have an opening in the schedule. So I'll see you next time. Adios, MMA aficionados.